Well, I just wanted to say welcome to Alma, and I'm just gonna say it, Dina, right? Okay, got it. New members, it's great to have new members. That's great, and we've sent this out to not only our member list but to all of our contacts. So if you're not a member, I would strongly encourage you to think about joining. Let's see. I just want to get some business out of the way really quick. So our next journal club is going to be November 16th. Is that correct, Chris? It'll be the third.
I don't have it pulled up, so I'll take your word on that.
Okay. And okay, 90% sure. And Chris has diligently put together a list that goes off for months, and so I'm going to get that up online so we can kind of get ahead. So we'll have the papers that we're going to do, and I'm going to get the papers posted online on our website so that we can get a little bit ahead of ourselves, and you can see what papers are coming up and get the papers significantly ahead of the meeting.
I thought these were great, two great papers. I thought they went really nicely together, talking about the Hopi cycle, which a lot of people in the society are much more well versed in than I am. But it was helpful for me to break down this paper particularly and outline
well, this is good, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, because the first time I read this paper through, which was probably last year, some of the things, took me by surprise. And first of all, some of McCluskey's methods I grappled with the first time reading it through. Because he didn't, he was doing this work in an age before Google Earth.
Yeah.
And I was certainly well familiar with going out and surveying, either using a theodolite or a compass and clinometer. But at the beginning, I wasn't really quite grasping how he was coming up with his azimuths and his altitudes and his declinations. So I went through it a little bit more. Just a couple things. I might pop back down to this, but this is an excerpt from Prendergast's paper in the Handbook to Archaeoastronomy and Ethnoastronomy, which several of you have contributed to. And this is really the only thing I've found that this blurb here in this one paper, which is then demonstrated much earlier in this McCluskey paper. I don't really know how much it has been used in archaeoastronomy. Of course, the McCluskey paper was the first time I personally encountered this methodology. And then here Pendergast talks about it a little bit, where I can just go through it quick. The orientation of a line axis can be numerically determined, provided that the planimetric or grid coordinates, the defining points of interest, have been measured in a national map projection system. The method can also be applied to deduce orientation of a building, regardless of its size. And the best fit equation takes this form. And then he talks about the tangent, basically the arctangent. If you just switch things around a little bit, this is basically the form it takes in McCluskey's paper. He just throws numbers around, but it was good for me to actually go through this exercise.
Yeah.
Because I don't, UTM coordinates and actually figuring out the horizon. The altitude by using elevation and in feet and distance in miles is certainly probably not armchair archaeoastronomy that we would use anymore. But we've kind of been talking a lot about methodology, and this is really I wouldn't say a unique approach, but I haven't come across it in any literature other than this paper personally. So I definitely thought it was worth maybe kicking off a discussion about if anybody has thoughts about that.
Chris, what I thought might be interesting about this is for somebody to take the time, maybe a younger person could take the time to actually use some of the tools of today. Like I'm thinking especially about JPL Horizons and essentially do the same
Oh yeah,
sort of analysis and see how close that comes up to the same thing that McCluskey did by going through all this trigonometry and space.
Yeah, that would be an interesting.
It would be interesting to see how, if they're I would imagine the integrity of both of them is such that they'd probably be within a couple of arc minutes of each other, but it would be interesting to see if it would be a good way to cross check McCluskey after the fact, I guess.
Yeah, and Google Earth has all the tools within it to do that. You can get a pretty decent azimuth and altitude, dipping into those tools a little deeper.
Yeah.
Well, from a methodology standpoint, my take, and he even mentions this in here, is computers are just becoming a tool that can be used. And so I took a lot of this as, before you had computers, you would have your maps of everything surveyed properly. This is how you would do it. Whereas we wouldn't even today think about this. We just ArcGIS or any of the Esri tools will solve this for us.
Right, or we would get on an airplane or a car and drag our theodolite out there. But the other thing is, it's a Hopi community, so that's probably easier said than done, maybe. And that could have been part of it.
So I think to Rick's point, what do you think the accuracy of this method is, or does anybody know compared to, say, modern methods with a theodolite? Because a lot of the paper hinges on comparing differences, right?
Boy, I wouldn't even be able to venture a guess.
When I have a couple of days with nothing to do, I'll try one and see what happens. But I mean, he's very specific about dates and phase angles and altitude and azimuth. I mean, it's very specific in the paper. It wouldn't be that hard to just like do a quick little survey or just cross check a handful of them, see how it works.
So it was interesting to me how he used a handful of dates and the solar longitudes, and then he grabbed his declinations through these calculations for the solar festivals, and then for the lunar festivals, using those same records and using his Fourier analysis, which quite honestly, the first time I read through this, which was probably about a year ago, I'm ashamed to say, it was a little heady, I guess, for me, and revisiting and really delving into it, it made a lot more sense this time through.
Chris, the major findings you have listed here, did you pull those right out of the paper, or is that your interpretation?
Well, yeah, I mean, the major findings, I didn't, not to jump right to them, but yeah, I mean, basically that the calendar, my interpretation of I guess what I found most interesting, I shouldn't say major findings, that was probably a misnomer, but the calendar, the important thing is the calendar was used both for agricultural purposes and to schedule the religious festivals. But the other thing I found really interesting was the towards the back end of the paper, when he starts really talking about intercalation, how typically cultures will take every third year and insert a lunar month to make things align. But here they seem to have done a half intercalation of only a half a month, which means they would have to do it much more frequently. And I would think it would probably require a lot more tracking. So I don't want to just leave this up the whole time, but I'd like to hear others' opinions on some of that and see your faces.
You were talking about other cultures, and I'm not Jewish, but I sort of worked in an environment where I had lots of Jewish friends, and they had their holidays, and they knew I was interested in astronomy. And one of the gentlemen I worked with was had actually thought about becoming a rabbi at one time, and he was kind of talking about essentially all this same stuff. And so, I mean, really, the Jewish religious calendar is lunar, and the way they deal with the intercalary months and all that stuff is obviously pre-programmed and has been done for thousands of years. But it doesn't seem that much different. I mean, it just, from the standpoint of what you're trying to do is align your calendar with a system of months that don't exactly align with the year. And I think that's the most fascinating I found about the paper, is working through a society that uses both exactly at the same time. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure how to compare that. I guess I'm not worldly enough to compare that across the entire world, but essentially that's what the Jewish faith does. I mean, they have, they operate their lives on a solar calendar like the rest of us do, and they operate their festivals on a lunar calendar, and they have to sort of make them reconcile at periods of time. It sounds like this is what this is about too. So
Sure. Next to day and night, probably the most obvious cycle is the lunar phase changes over the course of a month.
Right.
If they were just looking up, and so most calendars would start off that way, but it's, the lunar calendar is 11 days short of the solar calendar. So if you have, I'm sorry, Ray.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, I'm happy to hear from you.
Well, I just want to point out for the people who have dealt with this with Stephen's paper for the first time, that this is a tour de force, his paper, about the lunar and solar calendars at Hopi, and that when this came out, this paper blew me away at the time, and it was a great help to me to understand better the distinctions between the two sets of festivals, and the fact that there is this set of festivals, of women festivals that are distinct and still require solar and in lunar observations. So I just wanted to point that out to people who are encountering this thing for the first time. It was dramatic in my view.
Yeah, I think I agree.
the paper I printed had it in 1977. Is that just the reprint by NASA, or I mean, when did this appear in a book, or does anybody know the sort of the history of this particular paper? Right? Do you know?
Yeah, this came out in the Journal of the History of Astronomy in 1977.
Okay.
Yeah, so it as I say, it was one of the first attempt that I know of to actually put all of this down and do it in a serious way. Steve spent quite a bit of time at Hopi getting to know people and getting to know how their calendars worked. So it's an illustration, in my view, of how you really, for trying to understand cultural astronomy of current cultures, people living today, you really have to be there and involve yourself in the society enough so that you can understand it, because a lot of it's pretty opaque to the Western vision and well, the Western vision. So
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's almost impossible to, to discuss, these topics from a purely astronomical or even, observational perspective without without the, understanding the culture and how people looked at it. I'm going to share out this again just for a moment. And if I can figure out the view again. Did that work? Did not. Slideshow. So I also went through the paper and picked apart, the middle of it to go through and actually take a look at the ceremonies that he was talking about for my own, for my own edification. And it was interesting that three of the, out of these, only three of them were really based upon solar observations. Is it Wuchim? Am I saying that correctly, Ray? The first one was based upon solar observations during the sunset, anticipatory observations, which would lead to a 5-day celebration just around mid-November, which was the beginning of their cycle. And that would lead on to more sunset observations approaching the winter solstice. But afterwards, it really it turned over to lunar watching, and they actually changed who was doing the watching.
right.
So the societies would change from the solar societies after Soyal to the lunar societies, and they would take over the scheduling and the smoke talk. So I thought that was also pretty interesting. And the other thing I liked that was this happened twice a year. I don't know if it was this paper. This paper talked about it a little bit, how the first half of the season and the second half of the year, you'll notice the month names are the same, almost like a duality of like the hands coming together, and with the names matching and lining up. And each time here they have a solar observation like Soyal or Niman Kachina. Right after that, the sky watching responsibilities switch hands again to the lunar societies.
I think the message, the simple message from this is how complex the system is. And which is one reason why the Europeans who came in and tried to understand what was going on didn't get it, because they didn't bother to spend the time to understand it in detail. I mean, there were some obviously people like Stevens and Fuchs, of course, made a valiant attempt, but they got pieces of this. But it really took, I think it took Steve's paper to bring it all together.
And I think the complexity, and it's not just all astronomy based, right? I think a lot of it's trying to focus on how they could have used, you know, astronomy as the calendar, but trying to rectify the solar and lunar cycles. You see that there's clearly some cultural forcing functions to kind of reset the dates, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a formulaic. It just sort of seems like it's part of the culture, part of the different societies are making those. They're kind of these little resets that happen to keep everything going in the right way. So it's much more complicated. That's one thing I really liked about the paper was it's the astronomy is solid, but it also hints that there's this other stuff that's really affecting how it's being interpreted.
Right, right.
And I think to your point, Ray, that's a perfect segue into what Brian's article about just missing half of the stories just from the ethnography, from the male-female perspective.
True. Yeah, because after it, you know, after the August ceremonies, the rest of the cycle till you get to the renewal in November were the women's ceremonies.
Yeah, the thing that strikes me is putting the two together. I'm glad you chose these two papers, Chris, because the Bryant's paper allows one to see how these calendars can be observed visually through the use of a potential Hopi marking, if you will, or visual reflection of the calendar and the different ceremonies. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the one thing though I'm a little struggling with Brian's paper is when he starts talking about the women's societies and the mid-quarter days.
Ah, yeah.
Quarter dates, yep.
Because, well, I debated doing this, but I'm just gonna show the mid-quarter days, and what Belmonte's talking about is really this is really only considered a lot in societies that have Celtic influence, with Beltane and you know, May Day, things like that. So when we're talking about, and I just pulled this from Brian's paper, where we're talking about the mid-quarter days, which would the spring summer would be I'm assuming the May, right? May Day. And in August, but these line up, and this is really why I did this. I'd like to hear an opinion. I'm not trying to be contrary, but these women's ceremonies, it appears to be that they were also scheduled by lunar observations. Is that the opinion that others got from the McCluskey?
That's my understanding.
So
let me ask a question real quick. So
sure.
So in the McCluskey paper, comparing the two to Brian's paper, but I had to do it fairly quickly too. I sort of like went through and I was kind of focused on some of them, just how he dealt with calculations and stuff.
Mhm.
But he doesn't talk necessarily about the women's societies in his paper, right?
No, he does not.
No,
He does not.
I mean, he mentions these final three, and he doesn't the third one or the early September one. He doesn't use that exact term. I use that because that's what Brian used.
Right.
Um,
I think it's, Chris, I don't know if you're going here, but basically comparing Brian's sort of cross-quarter calculations and his thing to some of the stuff that McCluskey wrote about in here. It would be interesting to just note, I guess. I think they are lunar. Actually, I was assuming they were, but I didn't really look close enough to sort of see that.
well, the reason I even bring it up, I'm really fascinated by the whole concept of mid-quarter days. It's such a niche thing that I like it. and McCluskey actually did write a paper on that. I don't have the name in front of me now, but it's certainly based around Celtic, English, things like that, and there's been other suggestions that certain monuments might be aligned to May 1st or things like that within the Celtic world. And I've never heard it offered in the Americas, which kind of really intrigued me. I mean, I'm not trying to beat up on it. I'm actually fascinated by it, but I'm also trying to square it with what McCluskey says here about these women's harvest festivals being timed by lunar observations or the lunar cycle, and how that would square with what Brian found on the petroglyph.
right.
Hey, let me just add, this is Ron Barber.
Hi, Ron.
In studying shadow casting glyphs, we do find glyphs that mark the cross quarter. It would be interesting to talk to Ken Zoll. He's studied a lot of these shadow casters out at V-Bar-V and other places in Arizona to see if he's encountered those also. Has anybody else encountered these cross-quarter dates with shadow casting glyphs? Do you know?
Yes, at Paint Rock, Texas, we've got two that are hit that November cross-quarter. One that draws a horizon for a little figure to be standing on, and there's another where there's a ball player with an arrow through his head, and the sun goes right to the entry point of the arrow wound. On the cross quarter.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah, so these are out there. I think. I'm drawing. Who's the guy from JPL? Preston. I think Preston has found cross-quarter dates also, and so. I think they're out there. What would be interesting to do is to sort of correlate this information more broadly to see if it's draw some kind of conclusion to see if it really is a cross quarter they're marking. It could be some other kind of a festival that they've just chosen that happens to fall on the cross quarter. My own opinion is that I think it's an intentional marking of the cross quarter on a lot of these.
I would tend to agree with that. I also studied out at Paint Rock, and there was quite a number of markers that I discovered that occur on the cross quarter day. And I'm still really perplexed about the general Eurocentric paranoia of using the term cross quarter by the archaeoastronomy community, because as you mentioned, Preston, in one of their papers, they determined that 11% of their interactions occurred approximately 45 days before or after the equinox or solstices, which generally puts it right in a cross-quarter day pattern. And so that's not statistically insignificant at 11%. And I really don't understand why the archaeoastronomy community really has a I know, Chris, you're avoiding the use of the term cross-quarter day, because I think that I know Kim Malville is definitely a proponent against cross-quarter days in any fashion, but there does seem to be a significant amount of evidence for cross-quarter days. I mean, why would some cultures recognize it by a sun watcher and others not, when it can be calculated in many different ways, as they did at Paint Rock with hash marks, or tally marks. So
yeah, I think part of it that makes it a little difficult is the lack of ethnographic notation of it, and so I do rely heavily on ethnographic records, but the cross-quarter just seems to be lacking there. But of course, we need to recognize there's a lot of information that's not recorded in the ethnographic records, and maybe the cross-quarter is one of those.
Indeed. Now, when I use the term cross-quarter, I use that as instead of the equinox. I know that Brian used it as he used the term cross-quarter for what I would have called mid-quarter.
Mid-quarter, yeah. So I'm using cross-quarter with your terminology, mid-quarter. So
Right.
we're on the same
Right.
definition there.
So I believe out of all the records, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, Ray, I would call you the expert in the room on this one, but I believe that there's only one, possibly Tewa, mention of an equinox, and not quite sure how much cultural feedback that might have been from.
It's a good question. The problem that you have among the Pueblo people is that probably because of their encounters with the Spanish, and then later with Europeans, with other Europeans, is that they're a lot more closed about a lot of the information that you might think, that you'd find more open in the Zuni and the Hopi tribes. So there's a lot of information there, and probably the one writer, researcher I can think of who might have had that information is Florence Hawley Ellis, who worked very closely with the Eastern tribes because of her work in land claims. So that was one of the points that she makes in a paper that we're going to read together later, on the sun, moon, and star calendar, where she talks about the information, or rather the difficulty of finding astronomical information from the Eastern tribes.
Yeah.
I thought I might bring up the Eastern tribes, and here in the bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, Ken Leonard has surveyed a site which apparently has two groups of people operating the site and switching over at the solstices. And this is inferred from the rocks themselves and from deductions without direct ethnographic support. But I think it's really good work and an interesting paper. That's spring 2010, volume 71 of the Bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society.
Interesting. Yeah, Fred, I was thinking, you threw me there for a minute. I was thinking of the Eastern tribes in among the Pueblo people.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the Algonquin.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking the people along the Rio Grande. But
the similarity of festival that he talks about is remarkable. So there's a possibility that there's ideas spread slowly, even over language barriers.
or they were invented independently. I mean, there's an awful lot of independent invention. And the calendars, in one sense, are the same everywhere. The question is how you actually decide which dates are important dates for your festivals and so forth.
Right.
The ones, and maybe not all of those are really connected with a calendar. They're connected with something else in the society.
Well, that first new moon after the winter solstice comes up in an awful lot of places. And that may go back to that independent common source or independent invention. It's hard to know which.
Yeah, I would say it's probably a more ancient shared source, right? That, you know, from the same group, maybe 10,000 years before that, right?
Could well be.
Quite possibly.
Yeah, I would offer that it's probably a little bit of both. In the Americas, I think it's definitely probably a shared ancient source. But if you think about it, it's not too very different than the determination of the date of Easter, really. I mean, it's the same kind of principle. You know, it's not the solstice, and it's not the new moon.
Yeah,
I'm
which
sorry, Greg.
suggests. Sorry.
Mary's trying to contribute, but we can't hear her.
Oh yeah, Mary, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
She's not muted from a
No.
from a webinar standpoint. It's, I don't know. Sorry, Mary. We're just, your microphone isn't working for some reason. I wonder if it would be a good idea to get out and come right back in. Whatever.
Well, we're on the subject of Hopi. I'd like to bring up another calendar technique that they've used that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of information on, and that is here's a little graphic. These constructed structures where there's a little light port here. They face east, and the rising sun comes in and projects it onto the wall. And this sort of gives you about a calendar that's about 20 feet long. And so it just boggles my mind that you know, Alexander Stefan, I don't think there's any record of it, you know, in his journals anywhere. And you know, he's probably got some of the most complete write-up of observations out there. Of course, Cushing recorded these at Zuni.
Yes, right.
And of course, they're also known to exist in the along the eastern Pueblo up and down the Rio Grande. There are a couple of references there, but it just boggles my mind that there isn't anything in the old ethnographic reports about these out at Hopi. And so that's why I say, I think, you know, we always tend to quote the ethnographic reports out there, but there's a lot that's not included in there. And these are one of those that's not recorded out there.
You're absolutely right, Ron. And which is one reason why Greg and I have been so interested in getting the full Fuchs archive digitized.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
That's, I thought was one of the, when I was reading or looking at reviewing or skimming it or whatever I did, paper, I looked at it and said, well, you know, this is where the Fuchs archive would be very handy to be able to look and compare and to add to this.
No, it would actually. That'd be absolutely right.
Yeah,
and
and of
the
course,
archives of all the other folks there too. So
I think another set of archives would be Cushing's archives. Of course, he died early, didn't get a lot published, but his notes are available. I think back in the Smithsonian. And,
yeah, actually, yeah, we ran into him when I was back there the first time with Fuchs and stuff, and we actually found the original tissue accounts of his room counts and people counts and all that kind of stuff. So his stuff is there, yes.
Yeah. Has anybody looked through Cushing's notes that you know of? I ran across a grad student who was doing a study on, I think it was ethnobotany. And so we asked him to keep an eye out for calendrical information in there. And of course, you know, it's extremely large volume of information. But in the materials that he looked at, he did not find anything on calendar information.
No, when we were in a similar position. We were looking at Fuchs's stuff, and when we had a few minutes, we just looked at a few other people and found, you know, so much more there than we could ever get to. So I think it's, you know, the Fuchs archive is a stepping off point too, to trying to bring a lot of this information out.
Yeah. Speaking of Cushing's notes, let me bring up another type of solar calendar that we've been searching for but haven't found, and that's the Pillar of the Sun. And this is actually a sketch from Cushing's journal.
Mm.
You know, he describes a pueblo. He describes this stone that's embedded in rock, and it's standing up. And as the sun rises, this stone then casts a shadow. And so I've tried tracking down the pueblo that he describes, but have not found it. And of course, even if you found it, the stone may not be standing. But Cushing talked about the pillars of the sun, as well as I think it was Mendeleev talked about them. And so again, these are out there, but they're completely valid techniques. But I don't think we've found any of those. At least I'm not aware of anybody. I do show, of course, you know, this monolith out at Yellow Jacket, and it's possible that perhaps that was, you know, some kind of a shadow casting, so I've been looking for standing stones, you know, and of course
there's a beautiful example in Slick Rock Canyon.
Slick Rock.
Yeah, Slick Rock Canyon. Yeah, off the San Juan.
Mm-hmm.
I'll get you the exact information on that.
Yeah. Okay.
In fact,
yeah.
I have a few pictures I can send.
Okay, that would be great. And so out at Zuni, there's a site called Kaikama, and it does have standing upright sandstone slabs, and they are on the east side of the village, and they do face the rising sun. But the structures, of course, are are no longer there. And then, of course, up at Coalbed, there are some standing, a series of standing pillars there. Those perhaps were used the same way. Don't really know. Greg,
Yeah, I was attended a Zoom, something else. Probably those were more like elements of a colonnade along in there. Those particular standing stones probably were not, they were probably part of a wall surface rather than individual standing stones with the remaining.
yeah, they actually stand out from the wall itself, but it doesn't make sense the way they're stood up there. But
yeah, well, definitely more study is needed. But also to get back to your monolithic yellow jacket, one of the other things that the Fuchs archive materials will show is there's actually a picture of Fuchs standing in yellow jacket when two of those monoliths were standing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was one right next to it that was shaped exactly the same way, in the exact same line and orientation. And Fuchs is standing between them, holding his hands one on top of each other. One has since fallen away.
Uh-huh.
So I would say that's a compelling case.
Yeah, yeah.
This is a good deal east of where you're talking about, but are you familiar with the White Shaman mural in South Texas, Pecos River style?
Mm-hmm.
That one, and if you haven't read Carolyn Boyd's book on it, it's exceptional. But there's a series of holes in the bottom of that shelter, only one of which we've really done much with. There's a kind of inexplicable red triangle about maybe 15 feet to the left of the primary mural. And we were able to figure out the largest post hole. That's a winter solstice mural. And when the sun sets on winter solstice, were there a post in that hole, it would completely obscure the triangle when the sun sets on that day. So I suspect the other post did something similar, but we haven't reconstructed it in any way that would let us actually make that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so anyway, keep an eye out for these pillars of the sun. They're recorded, but I'm not aware of anybody who's conclusively come across and documented and found one. And
so the one I'm referring to, it was a natural pillar, maybe 50, 60 feet high, and it cast a shadow. And as the shadow changed, it went from incredible petroglyph murals, right? Like, so that it was like some sort of lesson almost, it was pretty cool.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll follow up with you, Roger. It sounds interesting.
Yep.
You're on mute, Chris.
I was on mute. Sorry. I was just asking if Mary got her microphone fixed. No, I'm sorry.
Send a note out. Maybe your kid stole her headset.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Dina asked in the chat,
Grandkids.
is there any firm evidence that the biquarterly celebrations or ceremonies did not occur before Western influence arrived? We were kind of touching on that, but specifically.
I guess
Any
my
thoughts on that?
question then would be, do we know for sure that they did not institute that on their own before the arrival of the colonizers?
Oh, I think the Hopi calendar that Steve McCluskey was writing about is actually the best preserved pre-contact information there is.
Okay.
As opposed to some of the Eastern settlements that, at least on the surface, adopted the Western calendar early on. The Hopi did not. But that's certainly interesting stuff about the mid-quarter days. Just to fall back on it, There's so much talk about cross-quarter days and equinox and ethnography, that mid-quarter would be doubly so, right? But it's interesting.
Can I ask a naive question about the definition of cross-quarter days? So I've heard in the discussion tonight, kind of going back a little bit, I think, Ron, I think you were saying like 45 days after an equinox, or right, that would be a mid-quarter day, but that's not observational, right? The sun isn't between equinox and solstice 45 days after the equinox. And so what is it? Is it based on observational, or is it based on a day count? Or how are we using it?
I think early on, Alexander Thom, when he was surveying some of the megaliths in Britain and Ireland and Scotland, came up with the term.
This is that Celtic relationship.
Well, prior megalithic, he came up with the idea of a megalithic, not seasons per se, but he was the first to contend, that not only the solstices and the equinoxes, but he was doing it by solar longitude, I believe. Again, he wasn't really counting days. He was counting positions of the sun, and then whether or not there was any validity to that or not, I think most of that has been received poorly in recent years. But then, of course, there's strong Celtic influence for the.
But the mid quarters are also close to like lunar min and lunar max, right? So there's definitely, that's an ancient, Eastern and Western, tribes were. There's definitely some evidence of that.
Isn't that cyclical? That's not necessarily. It's not necessarily always that way, is it? I'm trying to think through the mechanics, but it's not.
Well, the lunar cycle is 18.6 years.
Right, but the midpoint of that lunar cycle is like, could be that, right? So it varies on either side of that, but that's could be that, right?
Well, that one to me, that's even stickier, because there's no ethnographic evidence whatsoever of any lunar major or minor standstill stuff in the ethnographic record. The first time the idea is even posited was in 1912, then again in the 60s by Thom.
Well, the Adena Hopewell Indians, like back the mounds people, it's all over the place. It was
you're talking about William Romain's work. Right.
Yeah, but I mean, it's all. I mean, but the Adena Hopewell is.
I don't.
We're tracking.
Yeah, I don't. I know what you're talking about. I'm just unclear of it. There's actually 3 locations that I think there are possible ethnographic evidence to support it. One is a temple of Thoth in Egypt. That's pointed to a lunar maximum. One is a temple of to a moon god, that's pointed to a temple maximum, lunar maximum, and one is in Petra, where they are specifically lunar temples that we know of, and that they point this way. But they're kind of one-off. So,
but we have mounds in Pittsburgh that there's a central mound, and then there's at the lunar min, lunar max.
Mm-hmm.
There's other mounds, right? And
so
I mean, they were lining these things up.
I know. I just don't know what to think about it. It kind of goes back to.
What's that?
Where are these mounds? What state?
Well, so it was the Adena Hopewell, but Pittsburgh is right in Pittsburgh. There's like a
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Let me know.
Yep. And Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio is the sort of the center of that. Yeah,
right.
Incredible stuff, just incredible.
Right.
Well, we get back to the same argument of, okay, it was recorded, but how was that information important to the culture?
Right. Well, it goes back to
But we
premise.
rely on ethnographic evidence, and in some
Well,
ways
there
it's
the
faulty.
culture was decimated, right? At least the
Right,
Hopi
yeah,
survived to
we
tell their
have no
story.
idea why. Yeah,
Yeah.
and we never will.
Right.
Well, the lunar minimums and maximums would take a lot of record keeping. And going back to Rick's general question on the cross-quarter days or the mid-quarter days, is that most of the time you see the cross-quarter days are on calendar day count that you see today. They, designate the cross-quarter day. There's also a geographic or celestial longitude declination, right ascension of halfway point, midpoint. But those are, I would suggest that those are very difficult to calculate to a greater or lesser extent.
Well, there's also a horizon viewpoint, right? So
Right.
it doesn't take much technology to pick a point on the horizon that is between an equinox and a solstice.
To a point,
And
if you have
when-
a
and the
straight,
sun can rise there, but that wouldn't necessarily be a 45-day day count. for
Right,
one of the
right.
Well, it's not a day, it's a position and day count are two different things.
Right.
right, but the position, Rick, I hear what you're saying, but that, unless you have a straight, flat horizon,
Right.
Depending on whether you have an elevated horizon, the sun rises later than the actual day, et cetera, or earlier if you have a negative horizon. So picking out especially on a hilly horizon, to pick out a geographic point in between, I think that would be challenged to a point. Whereas a day count you've got examples of, I think that maybe that's even in Hopi where they used a stick or they used rocks and they counted every day and they put a notch on the stick or that kind of thing. I think recording, the cross-quarter day there is some evidence out there indirectly that they were able to count, whereas finding the geographic position of the sun in the midpoint there, or finding and having the ability to record an 18.6 year lunar cycle is really a challenge, especially when these people didn't live very long in retrospect.
It's kind of the holy grail, right? Is trying to
Yeah.
figure out if somebody
I
can
mean-
predict a lunar cycle.
I'd like to argue a little bit with that, because the position that the moon, the summer moon comes up, moves along the horizon, and there is a furthest southerly point. And that's a very easily observed phenomenon.
That's what I was referring to. And it happens quarterly, right?
No, it happens on the 18-year cycle.
On the 18-year cycle, exactly.
Yep. Yeah,
No.
but even within a 1 year cycle, right? There's still a maximus and a minimus for the moon,
For the year.
and that changes. But like even within a year, that kind of lines up to that mid-cycle direction. That was all I was saying.
Well, yes, but certainly the southerly rising point of the moon oscillates around the winter solstice position on one end. And
It would take a lot of
it's
record
9
keeping.
years maximum to minimum. And so it comes up to that further southerly motion. It's pretty obvious within several times within a human being's lifetime.
I
would be
disagree with that. So but that's fine.
I would disagree as well. I think it only becomes obvious if you have a reason for it to be obvious, like Tim's arguments at Chimney Rock, where there's a localized phenomena that presents itself at a lunar maximum. Otherwise, if we don't have, as Ruggles would say, one word of ethnography is worth 1,000 alignments.
Boy,
If we don't have one word of ethnography, all we have is alignments. And the best argument I think that could be made is the Scottish recumbent stone circles and how they point. So if you take the three examples I cited that have pseudo ethnographic stuff, and you take out Chimney Rock and you take out the recumbent stone circles, the next thing you're left with, I believe, is probably Bill Romain's work in the Ohio River Valley with the Adena and the Hopewell. And I don't, you know, they're visually compelling. They're visually compelling for sure, but there's no ethnography and there's not enough examples to make a statistical case.
Right.
So if we don't have ethnography and we don't have statistics on our side, all we have is visually compelling.
I think it is statistically significant. If you just walk around them, it's pretty obvious these things line up, and they're tracking those things. So, but they're just not recorded, right? No one's looking for it.
Yeah,
What I'm saying.
I mean,
Yeah, it's a matter of data collection and also the realization that maybe what was being recorded back then had a meaning that is locked back then.
yeah, and it very well could be. I can't bring myself to say one way or the other.
Well, that's
because of those reasons.
I think this discussion just sums up the challenge that this field of study encapsulates. I mean, there's could it be done, how could it be done, and then whether it was done, right? Those are very
Why
different
was it
questions.
done?
And why was it done? So there, you know, and I think it's sometimes you have to step back and we might not know, as Greg was saying. I mean, that information is locked in the past. And so I think that's just something we have to accept.
So
Yeah, the best you can do.
It's not for us to know.
Right. Well, the best you can do is make your best case. And God knows there are enough, those of us who've been doing this for a while have done a lot of analysis of, or speculation, let me put it that way, about what was going on and what people were observing and what meaning it had for them. But ultimately, we just have to live with the fact that we don't know an awful lot, and we'll probably never know for sure. But that's part of, in my view, that's part of the draw of cultural astronomy, that there's a lot of interesting aspects to it. And it's worth, yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Ray.
ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted everybody to know that Mary's mic isn't working, but she's not silent. So if you want to drop into the chat, you'll see that there is, and officially confirming that yes, there were celebrations performed before Western civilization. And I love your thought about celebrating in the dark because you couldn't do it otherwise, and now celebrating the day because you can. And sorry about COVID. Gosh, we got to live through this COVID and get back to our gatherings and celebrations again for sure. So thank you, Mary.
Well, I think we all have to be very careful about Western contact and ethnographic information. Just to give a good example of what I experienced at Paint Rock. On a number of occasions, there were different Native American groups there on equinoxes and solstices and whatnot. And there's one particular glyph that is thought to be either a ladder going down to a cave on the Santa Rosa, which is a plateau close by, or some people have believed that it was a canoe that brought the first people. And the interesting thing is that there's a book on Texas rock art or Texas writing, and in 1938, and that it describes that second scenario. And when I asked this one Native American group what they thought about that, almost regurgitated the exact wording of that 1938 book describing that particular glyph, which, I just found really bizarre because obviously somewhere that had been placed in their mind.
Who was it that said that? What group was that?
Huh?
Who
I
was
can't
it?
remember which, that was a group out of San Antonio, as I recall. I don't
Okay.
remember which tribe, but there's a lot of, there's 3 different tribes that, as I recall, kind of claim Paint Rock, which was a nomadic site anyway. So there could even be more. So. We just have to be real careful about what we read and what is told to us. Going back, I don't know whose comment is it, Rick, or about Steve's probably, or Chris, probably Steve's Hopi stuff is probably some of the most accurate ethnographic information from a culture, pre-contact. So
I thought it might be interesting. Maybe try to get a hold of Steve McCluskey for tonight's discussion and see if he would look at it differently through today's lenses.
Yeah, that would have been interesting.
Well, if that's the case, thank you all for coming.
And it's a nice lead into the next.
Yeah, and I would encourage all of you, if you aren't members of the society yet, please go to the website and sign up, and we'll be in touch with those. Maybe we'll see what we can do with you.
Great, thanks.
Good night, all.
Love it.
all right, good night. Good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Right.
Good night.
And thank you, Barry, for sharing.